Hello and welcome. This training module is Module 7, which is Aquatic Crossing Assessment Design. And this module is part of the ALIGN program. ALIGN stands for Asia's Linear Infrastructure Safeguarding Nature. The ALIGN project, as you can see here, is funded by the United States Agency and International Development. It aims to conserve biodiversity and support livelihoods in response to Asia's rapid expansion of linear infrastructure, especially roads, rails, and power lines. So part of that ALIGN project are these training modules, and like I said, this is Module 7. My name is Matt Blank. I am, I guess, a hydrologist, also a hydraulic engineer. They kind of go hand in hand a little bit. I am a research scientist and assistant research professor, jointly appointed between the Civil Engineering Department and the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University. I also am a partner in a consulting business called Restoration Engineering, where I do applied water resource projects. And in many cases, I do a lot of fish passage and aquatic connectivity projects. Like I said earlier, this is Module 7, and the module is focused on aquatic passage assessment and design. There's basically 4 parts to this presentation. Part 1 is kind of a little background. It's a pretty high level background. Doesn't get too far in the weeds anyway. And that background looks at some aquatic connectivity and passage overview. It provides a little bit of information about what creates barriers, and in that part there also is some discussion about fish locomotion. Part 2 is assessment of existing crossings. Part 3 is design of new crossings, and then the 4th part is some other considerations for those that are tasked with either evaluating existing crossings with crossings of aquatic systems or designing new ones. Few more things before I get into part 1. Following presentation is from on-the-ground projects across North America. Those projects include both research projects and actual applied on-the-ground projects where structures were built or removed. The Asia context might be slightly different. However, the techniques within this presentation are very transferable to any aquatic environment in the world. And also, I want to just caveat the presentation that the focus of it is going to be on highway and road crossings, but the same techniques can be applied to any kind of linear infrastructure crossing water systems or water bodies. So that would include rail lines and, of course, transportation corridors. So part 1, overview of aquatic passage and connectivity, basically what creates barriers, and then a little about it. So background, some fun fish facts, I like to call it. There are over 14,000 fish species, freshwater fish species across the world. And there's new ones being discovered fairly often, actually. Fish migration is a worldwide, well-known phenomenon. Some of the more common examples would be salmon in the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans migrating into rivers and streams for spawning, or all the various eel species in our oceans and rivers that migrate into freshwater systems for spawning as well. Some of those migrations are super big, very long, hundreds of miles, and in some cases with salmon, even over 1,000 miles. Other species of fish still need to move some, various distances and lengths as well. So why is aquatic connectivity important? All fish and all aquatic organisms need to freely move up and downstream throughout whatever habitats they live in order to complete their life histories. That's the basic concept here. In addition to this passing the organisms, though, aquatic connectivity is kind of the broader name, and that basically involves maintaining a river or stream's ability to function naturally, and that means it has the ability to transport woody debris and sediments, and nutrients, and obviously water is a big part of that movement. Last bullet here, the top ranked strategy recommended by biologists to conserve biodiversity in the face of climate change is to highlight it and made big, improve habitat connections, and reduce barriers to movement. That is true for aquatics and terrestrials, and they really truly are one and the same. But what creates a barrier and why? And then, like I added to that title, in other words, what do we want to avoid creating in these river and stream systems? And there's a few things. The first would be high water velocity, which this upper right photograph shows. And that's just when structures are designed too small, they can concentrate the flows and increase that flow rate, which would then increase the velocity, and therefore creates a barrier to fish that can't swim very fast. The second type of barrier that can be created is when the water is too shallow within the structure itself. It's just simply not deep enough for the fish or other aquatic species to move through it. The third most common type is what's called an outlet drop, which is basically the distance from the water surface in the structure to the height of the water downstream of it. That creates an outlet drop, and therefore would require the fish to leap into that structure. Many fish leap, but all fish can only leap so high, and many fish don't leap at all, and other aquatic organisms don't leap at all. Many of the other aquatic species don't leap either. So by having any drop, or certainly a big enough drop, you're going to completely isolate fish from moving upstream through that structure. And then the other one that's equally important and is kind of often tied in to creating some of these other issues is this debris and sediment blockage. And basically that's where the structure blocks sediment and or woody debris, or in some cases just large amounts of vegetation that move through aquatic systems, creates a dam, and then that creates a barrier. So fish locomotion, these are some of the factors that are tied into fish locomotion. Fish locomotion is the fancy pants word for fish swimming. And the biggest things that control it would be towards the top here. Each species of fish and then the sizes of the fish within those species swim differently. Larger fish within a species generally swim stronger and faster than smaller fish. However, interestingly, the little fish, the juvenile fish in many species, relative to their size, are better swimmers than the bigger fish are, which I think is just kind of an interesting thing. Temperature, the water temperature is a big factor. All fish species have an optimum temperature range, and within that optimum range is where they can swim at their highest performance. And then when the temperatures are either too low and or too high, their swimming ability is minimized or reduced. And then there's these other conditions or factors that play into how a fish moves and swims about. Past research has been done for decades now, and it's still continuing to be done. Generally, some of the research for fish swimming can be characterizing how fish swim and placing their swimming into three modes. The first mode is what's called sustained swimming, which is swimming that is maintained for an indefinite period of time. And the analogy for that would be a human walking. Granted, most humans can't walk forever, but we can walk for a very long time. The second mode of swimming is what's called prolonged swimming. And that's steady swimming that's maintained for times between 15 seconds up to 200 minutes. So it has a point of exhaustion to it, meaning there's time dependency to it. The third mode is, just stepping back to prolonged, in prolonged swimming, the analogy would be humans jogging. We can jog a pretty long time, but many of us will get tired relatively fast. The third mode is what's called burst or darting swimming, and that's the very high speed, short duration. Most research places starting swimming for freshwater fish at less than 6 to 15 seconds. And the analogy with humans would be sprinting. We can sprint fast, but not for very long. So that's a little background. Now we're going to move into an assessment of existing crossings. So if you were tasked with roads that are already in place, maybe you're rebuilding them, or maybe you're just assessing the degree of connectivity through them, these are some approaches that you can use to help you do that. So generally speaking, broad range of assessment techniques can be split into what are called direct approaches, and then there are indirect approaches. So direct approaches first, they're generally more time consuming and they're a bit more expensive to implement. But what a direct approach is, where you're actually actively measuring the movement of the fish through that structure, and trying to understand when they can move through, if they can move through, and what kind of conditions they're able to move through. And that's generally done using some sort of tagging type experiment. You can do mark recapture studies. More commonly today with structures, I see a lot of, or we also do this as well, where you have what's called passive integrated transponder tagging. So that's what the PIT stands for. Basically, that technique, you insert a little small chip into the fish, you put antennas into the stream and the structure itself, and those antennas record when that fish moves by them. It provides a timestamp for each individual fish, and then you can also know the exact location they were. And then if you're monitoring flow conditions and depths and whatnot at the same time that you're monitoring fish movements, then you can get an understanding of what creates barriers and what doesn't create barriers to them. Video and visual observations also play into directly viewing or measuring that movement process. Indirect approaches are basically a bigger group that is probably more commonly used because they can be done at slightly less expense and they can be used to cover greater numbers of sites. And oftentimes what we'll do is you'll start with an indirect approach, and that might help identify certain issues in certain sites. And then you might go back in and do a direct approach once you've already gotten the big picture view. But the indirect approach, one of the common tools is what's called a regional screen, where you're developing thresholds. I'll talk a lot more about that in a minute. Hydraulic modeling is an indirect approach because you're inferring passage through a structure by modeling the water flow through it, which establishes depths and velocities within it. And then understanding what those depths and velocities are, you can look to the swimming locomotion, speeds of fish, the prolonged and sustained swimming of fish, and then you can kind of synthesize the velocity and depth from the modeling with the swimming performance of the fish and get a feel for how well that structure may or may not be passing fish. You can also look at comparisons of up and downstream fish population characteristics, and there's some folks who look at genetic differences above and below crossings. Kind of digging into this assessment tool, and like I said, it's a very common approach, especially when evaluating many crossings. And that approach is where you basically develop a regional screening tool. And I'm going to go through an example of how we recently used this technique. And by giving that example, that'll hopefully explain how this process and technique works. So the steps in the development of a screening tool and then application of it. First key step is to identify a species or a group of species of interest that you want to evaluate the crossings relative to that species' ability to swim and leap. So that's the species. Pick the species, then you gather whatever information is available for that species. Generally speaking, you want to pick a species where we know something about their passage capabilities, we know something about their swimming performance. Sometimes you can use surrogate species. Basically, you select a species that we know something about, even though the species you're looking at has no information on it, you know it's very similar to another one. So based on that, that's going to give you your physical swimming abilities of that species. From that, you develop a screening matrix. Then you take that matrix and then using it, before you use it actually, you can go in and actually physically survey and measure all the physical characteristics of the crossing site in the nearby river or stream channel or wetland channels. And And then you take that screening matrix and those physical measurements, and you apply the matrix using those measurements, and that develops and identifies passage concerns you may have. It also is a way to identify crossings that are performing well. So not all crossings are problems. There's many road stream crossing, many rail crossings that function very well. And so this is a sort of an objective means of looking at them all, the goods, the bads, and the others. So applying that, I'm going to go through an example that we recently have done here in North America. We looked at both terrestrial and aquatic passage for a corridor along Highway 191 in Montana. And this is the red line is the corridor itself, highlighted here. It starts near Bozeman, Montana, and then it goes south from there through a lot of national forest lands. There's some mixture of private lands within this corridor, and then it drops down in the southern end into Yellowstone National Park. So it runs through a classic mix of public and private lands, and then a very protected land in the world's oldest park. So step back here real quick, sort of flip around here. So this is the process that we used. So I'm going to work through that process and the aquatic portion only, obviously, of how we assessed it. So we first chose a species of interest. And in this crossing, one of the more important native species is cutthroat trout. And so that's the species we chose to represent the species of interest. And therefore, we looked at that particular trout species, and we gathered whatever information there was on their swimming performance. And then from that, and past studies of cutthroat trout, West Slope cutthroat trout, past field studies, past lab studies, then we used that key species to develop our matrix. And this here is an example of a matrix. You'll see them as in tabular form. Sometimes they're like a flow chart. You look at this is yes or no, then do this. There's multiple ways to do this, but in this case, we developed this table basically as our matrix. And there's 4 parts to it. And it doesn't always have to have these few parts, or only 4 parts. You can have more or less. The first one is if the structure itself has continuous substrate throughout, and there is no outlet drop, and the slope is relatively shallow, less than 1%. If those conditions exist in crossing, we consider that to be adequate for passage of cutthroat and fish in this region, and therefore it's a green ranking. So green, go, green light, things are good. The second criteria or level we have is where your outlet drop was greater, the structure's outlet drop was greater than 0.34 feet, or the slope is over 1%. That ends up identifying potential concerns in that structure. And so we identified that as a may or may not be adequate for unimpeded passage. We really don't know. It's probably providing some passage. The degree to which it's providing that passage we don't understand necessarily that well. We give that a grade. Then the next criteria is if the outlet drop is greater than 0.34 feet and the slope is over 1%. In addition, there is no internal baffles, which are just simply angular brackets and blocks and whatnot that are used to help fish passage. If there are no structures like that and these other 2 criteria are present, then we consider that to be not adequate, potentially not adequate for unimpeded passage of fish. That would give a red ranking or a bad ranking. And then the last is probably the most extreme in this case, where if the slope is more than 3%, or the outlet drop is greater than 2. So it's an either or in this case. Those are pretty extreme conditions for most fish to get through. If either of those exist, then it's a red ranking, and it's considered that it may not be adequate for repeated passage to fish. So that's how we created that ranking using information we have on our species of interest here. One thing to note, a lot of times the rule of thumb is to pick the weaker swimming fish in your watershed, develop the criteria for the weaker swimming fish. And the idea there is if you are assessing things for the weaker swimmers, if it's, therefore you're actually assessing it with the I guess, the conservative understanding that better swimming fish are also going to be able to move through these structures or not move through them potentially by using the weakest swimming fish to develop that criteria. So it's a conservative approach. So some of the data, so now we're in that data collection phase a little bit. And here's a couple crossings we've worked on over the years. This is a subset of the entire, but it kind of gives you a big picture feel for the data you want to collect at each of the sites for the regional screens. Shape of the culvert, dimensions, the width of them, the slope of them, the length, the material, presence of baffling structures within the structure, presence of substrate or rocks, either purposely in the structure or not, outlet drop, water flow, and velocity. So flow is the volume of water per time, and the velocity is the speed of it. And then other data can be brought into this as well, depending on how much you want to collect. This is generally the minimum. A little bit of deeper discussion about a few of these factors, specifically slope, outlet drop, just to be clear on what they are for those that aren't necessarily dealing with this kind of structure all the time or these kind of structures all the time. So this is a cross section running right down the middle of a stream channel, so it'd be a longitudinal profile. And the black line would be the water surface. This is a culvert, for example. Here's the river stream bed. And then the road would be up here somewhere. So the upstream end of a structure, so the lowest part, so if you have a circular structure, the lowest part is always called the invert. So you have an upstream invert elevation you would survey. You would survey the downstream invert elevation. You would measure the length of the structure. And then the slope of it is just this elevation minus this elevation, which represents the drop height divided by the length. The other parameter we have discussed, but here's another example of it, is the outlet drop, which is the jump height, is the water surface elevation in the structure minus the water surface elevation downstream. Those two numbers, one subtracted from the other, gives you that height. And then tied to that would be pool depths, which is just depth of water downstream of the structure. Many times there are no pools, many times there are. And then you have what's called a tailwater control, which is actually part of the natural channel itself, or the river channel, or the stream channels. It's the elevation of the channel just downstream of the structure, and this elevation is important because it often will control the depth and speed of the water, even backwatering up into the structure itself. So that's why it's called a tailwater control, is because it often will control how the water flows through the structure, even though the structure is upstream. So we had a field crew that went out and assessed a bunch of crossings. Take a drink of water. And here's a couple photographs of the crossings while they were being assessed. This one here would be what's called more of an arch pipe, where it's wider at the base than it is tall. This has water just streaming right through it, relatively okay. And then this one on the right is a double barrel crossing. These are both arch type pipes, and each of these has an outlet drop. You can see this one's a little bigger than that. So once we surveyed all the data, which was the physical data about the crossing slopes and drops and whatnot, and then we applied the matrix to that set of data. One of the final products is a map identifying the green and the gray and the red crossings. So starting on the north end, the road, the numbers go south, and you can see as my cursor goes down, there's certain crossings that might be issues. Some of them are in good shape. Some of them are in that unknown, kind of uncertain category on where to place it. Moving south, lots of really good crossings, some unknowns. You know, there's just pockets of good and bad. It's pretty typical for large scale highway crossing, highway infrastructure assessments, especially if you're assessing crossings that have been on the ground for a long time. And so based on this information and the terrestrial movement information that we were gathering at the same time, that stuff was combined together into one report, and that report is then used to help the DOT understand where their issues might be, help the public understand where those issues might be, and then that collectively in this document can help move projects forward in terms of replacing them with proper structures in the proper places. So, little bit of a quiz review time here. So I got a couple questions coming. First is, what are the three swimming modes used to describe fish locomotion? So I'll pause for a moment here and let you think about that. Those modes would be sustained, prolonged, and burst, which is, again, sometimes called question 2. What are the 3 most common physical factors or conditions that create barriers to upstream fish passage? The answer to that question is not necessarily in this order, but insufficient water depth, which means too shallow, excessive velocity, and then outlet drop. And I believe there's question number 3, which is a multiple choice one, a little easier perhaps. What is the key difference between sustained and prolonged swimming modes? And the answer to that is prolonged swimming. And the reason is it has a time to exhaustion, whereas sustained does not. All right, moving on to the third part of this training module. We're going to talk through some approaches and considerations for designing new crossings. These are pictures of some pretty good crossings that were built in various places. There are 2 design approaches that I'm going to work through and discuss. The first is what's called a geomorphic design. And within that, there's kind of options called the stream simulation or no slope or embedded culvert. We're going to look at the stream simulation approach here. And then the other design technique I'm going to talk through a little bit is what's called a hydraulic design, which is a little more engineering, and it's a technique that you're designing the conditions for a specific fish only. And then ideally you would design them for a weaker swimming fish, and then the stronger swimmers can pass through those conditions as well. Before you go into either of these considerations or design methods rather, just big picture wise, when you're looking at a new crossing structure, what needs to pass through it? And there's some basic big picture things that need to pass through that crossing. Water being the first and foremost. There are going to be all sorts of different flows that pass through that structure, base flows and flood flows. The structures need to easily pass those. Sediment and woody debris and other materials that flow down the rivers and stream need to be passed seamlessly. And then, of course, your aquatic species, fish is kind of focus of this, but you have other aquatic species like amphibians or macroinvertebrates and others that ideally would need to pass through that structure as well. So all of this needs to be in the consideration. This here, regardless of whether you're doing, well, this would be more for a stream simulation or a geomorphic approach, but even if you're doing the hydraulic design approach, these are things that you want to consider. So this is a summary of all the data and information that you need to gather when you're going about doing a crossing design. And I'm not going to go through details on all of them too much, but you got hydraulic conditions, which are basically the structure, the size of it, the slope of it, that sort of thing. The hydrology, generally speaking, hydrology for this application is the flow rate that the structure needs to pass. And at the minimum, you're going to want to have a high flow passage design, a low flow passage design, and then you're going to have some sort of flood design that you're going to be looking at and checking to make sure conditions are appropriate for all 3. The biological side is the species, the size of them, and those sort of things. Geomorphology would be the river or stream or water body that you're crossing. What are the features of that? What are the size of the sediments that it moves? How big is it? How does it respond to certain flow events? How much woody debris moves down that channel? On the bottom, not to make these unimportant because they're not, are all the kind of more classic civil engineering things, right? Like your structural loads. That's a structure deal. How much weight's going to be on the structure? What's the active versus passive loading? what are the transportation considerations, geotechnical aspects of the setting, foundations, whether they get placed upon. And then the last tier, of course, is not unimportant at all, is the cost of the structure, land ownership, and stakeholder input. It's incredibly important stuff. So starting with a blank slate in an area where maybe there, hypothetically speaking, there are no roads. And there's definitely a lot of this will happen throughout Asia where there are new roads being proposed in areas that there are none. And this is kind of the decision matrix that you want to go through when you're tasked with putting roads in new places, or even considering realigning roads that are already there. Okay? So this is a survey of a hypothetical survey of a channel bottom of the topography of a river valley, basically. This blue line represents the surface of a river or stream within that cross section. So starting off, the first thing that should be considered is whether or not you need to cross the structures of body water or not. Ideally, if you can somehow avoid crossing that water body, that's the best situation. And there are plenty of situations where the designers and the group involved can kind of think about maybe there's a way to get around this river or stream without actually crossing. The next option would be what's called the full spanning bridge. And this bridge here would be spanning not only the active channel, but the floodplains, of course, the riparian areas, and even adjacent habitats to that. And especially if you're doing a co-design with terrestrial and aquatic species both in that design, these are the kind of structures that might be really useful to think about. The third option I'm showing here is what's called that stream simulation approach, but it also has some floodplain conveyance structures. So here's the bigger structure that I'll talk through a little more on the design method for it, where you're sizing the structure to accommodate the morphology of the river channel, and there by default you're simulating the channel through it. And then adjacent to that, you'd have smaller structures in the floodplain that provide flood relief when the water comes up. Hydraulic design, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, is the more specific engineering approach where you're matching the conditions, water depth, and velocity specifically to fish species of interest. And then the hydrologic design is designed for water only, and that's not commonly known. So, general considerations, bridges versus culverts is the gray area between them, of course, but a general rule of thumb is bridges such as these, if your bank full width of the stream channel is greater than 6.5 meters, you should consider a full spanning bridge. If the stream slope is greater than 6%, which is a pretty steep stream, you should consider a bridge. The other thing that really bumps you into bridge category, even on smaller systems, would be systems that move a lot of woody debris or a lot of plant vegetation. In tropical environments, there's often tons of plant material in the rivers and streams that's floating down. That can get blocked up by small structures and create diversion or damming effects. So these are some things to think about when you're just looking at the big picture, bridge versus culvert. Another thing to think about as a general consideration here, and we've already kind of talked about aquatic connectivity, is basically that big picture word for passing water and nutrients and sediment and organisms, all encompassing. But a really key part here is what this little diagram kind of shows. Here's a road, and here's a river that's coming down into it. Generally speaking, the river is going to want to move back and forth across its footprint. It's always doing that. All rivers are trying to do that. Some of them are able to do it more than others because some rivers are in confined bedrock channels, so they can't really move around much. But many rivers are very active and they move back and forth. So no matter how well you design your crossing in a river that's moving across its floodplain naturally, the road itself, whether it's a bridge or a stream, becomes a rigid, fixed object within that moving system. It's just something to think about. And in that thinking, short crossings are good. Align them with the stream course. Stream course is good, which means you're just aligning them in the standard direction the river's flowing. In a straight reach of stream, technically, because straight reaches aren't moving around side to side as much. And then a stable stream reach is something you really want to find before you start putting in new crossings on rivers and streams. Sometimes that might be the appropriate place to put a road from a transportation standpoint, But if it's not a stable stream reach, then you need to move that crossing to a stable place. That's where I'm going. So back to that, the two techniques. Let's dig into each of those a little bit more. The geomorphic design stream simulation technique. So that approach, basically, what you're doing is you're creating and maintaining a natural stream channel through the culvert or bridge. That simple. And the idea then, which is shown here second, is that if fish or other aquatic species are moving through the natural channel, okay, and you design the structure with a channel through it that mimics that natural channel, therefore the culvert should pass them just as easily as the natural channel does. And here's a couple pictures of a stream simulation designs post-construction. This would be kind of an indicator of an active or a bank flow width, one or the other. And so the structure you'll see is sized with bigger than that, so that you actually have bank lines through the structure itself. Here's another structure. This is a big concrete embedded structure. This one actually is embedded with probably 6 feet of concrete, or sorry, 6 feet of rock and stream material. And here's that same bank full width indicator in here. And then this one actually has a nice bank margin that can be used for small mammals. The other advantage of these kinds of crossings is, the picture on the right, the water is at a base flow. And as those flood flows come up, which means the water is going to be increasing in depth, that water can nicely and very easily and seamlessly spill onto the floodplains that are built within the structure itself. So some real basic concepts or steps in this process. You're basically measuring key parameters in the river, and you're basing your design off of those parameters. One of the most important ones is what this diagram shows to the right, which is the bank full width. In this case, it's basically this width right here. So you go out and you measure things like bank full width and stream channel slope and the substrate within the stream itself. And then you can base the culvert dimensions off of those channel measurements. And for some of the criteria, here's some simple relationships that were used or are used in various parts of North America. And so the culvert width, so the width of the culvert itself, in this case, is recommended to be 1.2 times this channel width plus 0.62 meters. So that number is allowing the culvert to be big enough that you have that margin area on either side of it. The culvert slope is often recommended to be less than or equal to about 1.25 times that upstream channel slope. More or less, you want to often have a range to some of your design parameters, because rivers and streams don't maintain a constant slope. They don't maintain a constant bank full width all the time either. So there's always going to be a little fluff in that. Some other kind of basic considerations for the geomorphic stream simulation design. Any structure can be used. You basically fill that structure based on the size of the stream you need and the depth. One consideration I think that's really important is, since you're building a channel through the structure, you need to make sure that the structure can accommodate the equipment inside of it to build that channel. Because it's really hard to build big stream channel materials by hand. And this is especially true when you have some of the smaller streams you're working at. Sometimes you just simply need to put a bigger structure in to accommodate the machinery that you need to build the channel. And here's just kind of a general rule of thumb. A lot of design guides would recommend that there's a big elliptical structure, right? And this is the sediment that's embedded and designed within that structure. Generally, the whole height of the structure, so the distance from here to here, roughly 20 to 30% of that should be considered or should be designed to have stream channel built within it. So a couple examples of this approach in practice. This is a before picture. So these two culverts were in the river prior to the replacement. They were identified as potential velocity barriers. So it was determined that they should be removed, and they were replaced using a geomorphic design. And here's the new channel. It's actually a bridge in this case, but here's that active width in this case, and there's the bank full width within here. You'll see those nice margins along the edge, which provide that almost riparian corridor through the structure. and certainly provide not only fish passage, but also small mammal passage and semi-aquatic passage as well. Another example of that technique applied in North America, here's the pre-designed culvert. So in this case, we had a smaller structure, and there was an outlet drop at the downstream end right here. Those two factors together created a barrier, or at least passage issues. And the new design here is a full spanning bridge in this case, with plenty of width to accommodate the natural flow through it, and then those bank lines. So a little bit about a second design approach, and that's the hydraulic design, where you're designing the culvert to pass a designed fish of known species and size. Based on that species and size, you know the depth and velocity that fish can maintain. This is an iterative process. Most engineering design is an iterative process. And what I mean by that is you basically select what you think might work, and then you do a bunch of calculations and analysis of that potential design. And 9 times out of 10, the first selection won't work. You'll have to modify it and then recalculate things, reassess things, evaluate that design. And then you just keep going back and forth through that process, circling through it until you come up with a solution that works. So in the hydraulic design, you're going to select your culvert lengths, sizes of them. You're going to identify your depth and velocity criteria based on the species. You're going to identify or calculate the flows, the hydrology in that region. What's a good high fish passage flow, a low fish passage flow, and what are the flood flows? Those are the minimum flows you'd want to evaluate. Then you can use different modeling or mathematical techniques to estimate water depth and velocity for these flows in these structures. And then you use those models or those mathematical techniques to do that. Then step 5 would be we're checking that calculated velocity and depth for those flows of interest. We're checking that velocity and depth against the swimming performance of those fish. And if the velocity and depth is less than the velocity the fish needs, then that might be a good design. And then you set your invert elevations, and generally within that process, you're also going to be checking the flood capacity of that structure, making sure that is also sufficient. One example of a hydraulic design that I was involved in quite a few years ago now, the structure has been pretty successful. The setting here is not unlike Northern Asia. It's along the Arctic Ocean. The fish that we were designing for here was Arctic grayling. And there are grayling throughout much of Asia, the northern parts anyway, Mongolia and Russia, and perhaps even parts of China. So this crossing here, we couldn't really do a geomorphic design because the setting was kind of a lake-to-lake, wetlandy kind of connection, and the loads and the traffic across the top wouldn't allow us to put in a full spanning bridge structures and that sort of thing. So we did a hydraulic design for those reasons. And the way our design came out is we ended up creating a main, bigger, corrugated structure that was designed to fill with materials. That's the fish passage structure. And because this region has really high flows that come very quickly during spring runoff, when the Arctic Ocean and the mountains that feed it break up, the water comes very quickly. And so we put in these large structures that were higher up, and those higher structures are designed to accommodate those higher flows. And then that way all the high flows are not just coming into that center channel. And then here's some pictures of some grayling that we've been studying in our flume systems here. And then here's actually, they're not the same fish, obviously, but these were some small grayling that are actually in the outlet of this structure. They're basically living in it. So I think we maybe did a decent job on that. Another quick example before I move out of this section of the training module, and that's just kind of a hypothetical example. This was a steep gradient system, lots of woody debris, lots of sediment. This was just a conceptual design that we came up with. And the solution here was a wide, full spanning structure. It's got bank lines for terrestrial, got basically a riparian through it. This structure not only accommodates fish, it also accommodates large flow events, very flood resistant, resilient, and likely would require less O&M, at least from a blowout standpoint. All right, little break here. Couple questions. First, what is the definition of stream simulation? Answer here is right there. Stream simulation is a method of designing crossing structures with the aim of creating within the structure a channel as similar as possible to the natural channel of both structure and function. So pretty straightforward technique that can be used anywhere in the world. Last question, question 5. What is the best approach for addressing aquatic connectivity? There's 4 options there in the multiple choice. The answer is avoid crossing the stream. All right. Bear with me here. We're in part 4, some other considerations, and then we'll wrap this up. So one of the big considerations as we move into the future is going to be accommodating larger flow events that are occurring more frequently in many parts of the world. In addition to that, the hydrologic cycle has become more erratic. Part of why we're seeing larger flows in some cases is because as the air warms, warmer air holds more moisture than cold air does. Basically, a degree of air temperature increase allows the air to hold 7% more water. And with more water in the atmosphere or in the air, then there's more water available to come down and rain and snow and hit the landscape and create these high flows. Here's a situation that occurred in Montana about 14 years ago. This is the Musselshell River. These are the previous highest flows recorded ever at this particular site in about 100 years of data. And then this particular year, there were 3 peaks, each of those individual peaks much higher than any of these previous recorded single peaks. And this is some photos of that happening. Clearly massive flooding occurring. I think it's very interesting. You see the highway in this case is basically a barrier to the entire river function. This is old oxbow habitat that's basically pinched off from the main river. And this stuff would, if it were properly connected, would allow some of that floodwaters to be stored in here and actually reduce the flood effect. So many countries, or at least some anyway, have adopted design methods that are going to accommodate larger flows already. In some cases, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, these things were adopted. Denmark, as an example, has established new crossing designs are going to be done for what's called a 1 in 500, which is a 500-year flood event, which is a 1 in 500 chance flood, which means it has a 0.2% chance of occurring every year. They've already increased their designs to that level. Prior to that, they were doing, which is a more common design, which is a 100-year design, which is a 1 in 100 chance flood, or a 1% chance each year. So they've already just decided and put into regulations, because things are changing, we are seeing higher flows. We're just going to start designing for that now, because these crossings are going to be in place for the next 50 to 100 years. Very smart thinking. Along these lines, other considerations that are tied in here is, generally speaking, the best approach is to co-design structures for both aquatic and terrestrial species when that makes sense. And this would be an example of a large spanning structure that is accommodating both river process, river flows, river function, riparian habitats, and terrestrial crossings in that case. This approach will maintain biodiversity and continuous habitat connectivity through infrastructure period. This approach will also generally accommodate those big flow events with plenty of room to spare. Couple last other considerations. There are new materials, quite a lot of new materials being developed. This is an example of a plastic material somewhere in Europe that was developed to span a waterway. And in this case, once the foundations are set, a crane just drops in this prefab bridge. And it's made of plastic, so it's light, it's cheap to transport. You don't need a super heavy crane to drop it down. You can plop it in on top of the structures and bolt it together, and it's ready to go in a very little amount of time. And they're very effective, they're safe, and we can use recycled materials to build them. So there's a lot of promise in the new materials out there. One last consideration. This entire conversation I've had, or this training module rather, is about providing connectivity and increasing connectivity. But unfortunately, many parts of the world are dealing with non-native species and invasive species that are really creating havoc with native species. And this particular culvert in Montana, this was basically redesigned. So it was already in place, and then this baffle wall was put into it. And this particular steel plate baffle, which is about 4 feet tall, creates an impassable barrier to upstream moving rainbow trout in this case. Rainbow are invasive in this case, and we're trying to keep rainbow from a cutthroat population upstream. So here's an example of purposely creating a barrier with the infrastructure to isolate and protect a native species. Lastly, there's a lot of free and also private software that you can use for hydrologic design, bridge design, culvert design. HEC-RAS is probably the most common. It's a freeware. It is used around the world by most engineering companies. And here's some outputs from that software. HY8 is a culvert design software. Culvert Master is a private one you have to buy. Fish Crossing allows the software allows you to synthesize fish swimming with hydraulics, which is kind of neat. And then HMS is just a hydrologic modeling software. So that allows the user to simulate rainstorm events and then how much flow they create. And then based on what this tells you, you put it in here and you design your structures. Some good resources that are out there already in various versions and free, of course. This is the National Inventory and Assessment Procedure for culverts. That allows you to assess culverts. In the assessment part of this module, I was using information from this particular document. Designing new structures, there's 2 examples of design documents right here and here. Here's the stream simulation approach, an entire free 700-page design document with tons of examples. It's a really, really, really well done document. So is this. And then as a more general road ecology, terrestrial, aquatic, all consideration guidance document information source is this handbook here. Here's some contacts for if you want more information about the Align program or perhaps this module. Appreciate your time, and thanks a bunch.